Hi guys. I think I restarted this. I'm not really sure. I think I did. I hope I did. If I didn't, you just heard me a second time. I might have messed it up. Who knows? Anyway, I was able to track down, well, with the help of Mrs. Walker, I was able to track down the workbook that we have been working through in social studies so it could give you a little bit of a visual of what we've been talking about. And so I wanted to go ahead and hit the four that we missed yesterday. And then if we can, I wanted to kind of jump into the South American one just a little bit. We don't really have to hit it too hard. Really, in all honesty, I just want to hit the North America the most. So again, that's kind of my goal. So you have a copy of this in your Google Forms, or you saw a copy of this in your Google Forms. You may not have done it yet, and that's totally fine. That's totally fine if you waited until you saw part two. But yours was color copied. This one is not, but that's okay because I'm going to walk you through some of this stuff today. We already talked about some of these colors. So I'm going to kind of hit and miss on those things. We did talk about the Southwest, and this was this little section right here. If you see my cursor, we did talk about the Southwest. Remember, they were the ones that had the pueblos. They were the ones that were kind of in the desert area, the dry area of the United States. So they had a little bit more that less that they could work with. We also talked about, just kind of going back and making sure, the Northwest Coast, which these were the guys right up here. That little sliver right there, and I think it was like a reddish color. Maybe it was brown. Is it brown? Red or brown? No, it's red. It was red. And we talked about how these guys, they had plank houses, totem poles, that sort of thing. And then we talked about the plains, which was this big spot here, the yellow spot. And this was the buffalo, the teepees. They moved with the teepees. They eventually had horses. We talked about southeast, which was right here. This was the light green. Savannah had a question about that. This was the thatched roofs, the wattle and daub. This was where they had the chickies. Remember, I called them chickadees. This is where they had the temperate. The temperature was usually high in the summer, and then it could dip to below freezing in the winter. So the temperature was very different. Then you had the Northeast, which we call the woodland Native Americans. And that was the ones who they had wigwams, they had longhouses, they had the standard deer and squirrel and bear and things that they could hunt. And so that was a lot of the things that they wore. Were they fished, they gathered food, they built permanent villages. Your typical the typical Native Americans that we studied before this pandemic was the woodland Native Americans. I don't know if we talked about the subarctic and the Arctic. So we're going to kind of hit them real fast. So the Arctic Native Americans were located, it's actually the dark blue color on your map. It was the very north part of Canada. And if you remember your geography, boys and girls, you'll remember that this part of North America, it was cold. Okay. The temperature was below freezing almost all year round. So, and you remember we talked about, how they were trying to get through to the Orient, things like that with the explorers. So again, that's what made it difficult up there, was because they did have a lot of glacier type an environment to get through. So the Arctic region is within the Arctic Circle, if you remember from geography. It includes northern Alaska, so you can see right there, it does include, kind of zoom in. For some reason, I can't get it to stay there. It includes northern Alaska, northern Canada. It also includes Greenland and some northern islands. It extends to even parts of Europe, including Russia. Obviously, the temperature is below freezing for a majority of the year. So with the Arctic Native Americans, they didn't have a whole lot to work with. Okay. So the American Indians who permanently settled in the Arctic region, they may have been part of one of the final groups to come to America during the Ice Age. And other groups of Native American Indians already occupied the land to the south, and so the Arctic Indians chose to settle near the sea in the frigid, the northern area. They were known as the Inuit. Okay. They had to adapt to the extreme climate. They had a lack of vegetation in the Arctic region. They learned how to hunt bears and elks and marine animals for food. Arctic Indians also, they fished, they gathered grasses and berries and roots when they could find them. But again, vegetation was very scarce. In the winter, the Arctic Indians lived in shelters called igloos. You guys have heard of those before, and I know you know what those are. I will do my due diligence, and I will show you if I can spell it right. Let me see if I can show you. I can get there you go. There's some types of igloos back in that time period. Those would be very cool to stay in. I don't think I would appreciate that. I'd rather sleep in a teepee. Okay. So they lived in igloos that were built of blocks of snow. Obviously, you can see that. When the temperature rose above freezing, the Arctic Indians often left their winter homes for long periods of time in search of food. They were nomadic, but they lived in tents covered with hides when they were nomadic, when they were traveling. They made clothes from animal hides. You can see an example of, maybe what we would stereotypically call like an Eskimo. They used sealskin to make water-resistant boots and wetsuits that help them stay warm while hunting in the icy ocean. So, using the whales they hunted for the meat, the Arctic Indians burned whale blubber for warmth and turned the blubber into an oil that they could use to waterproof their kayaks and seams of clothing. So they used whale blubber to help insulate themselves. They also used caribou hides. They used polar bear fur. They used whatever they could to keep themselves warm in this particular environment. So again, very different from the Southwest, very different from the Northwest. These guys had a more extreme environment that they had to adapt to. And these guys are up here at the top. The next ones were the subarctic, and that was the one in purple, I think. It was on your book. The color was purple. And this area was very cold too, but it wasn't as frigid as the Arctic region. So the temperature here was below freezing much of the year, but sometimes in the summer it would become warmer. And it would allow for some of the area's ice and snow to melt. So they had a little bit warmer temperature in this area right here. Again, you're in Canada. They lived in nomadic tribes. So they were mostly hunters. They were mostly fishers. They were mostly gatherers. In the winter, it was a pretty extreme climate. So they were not as extreme as they were in the Arctic. They had some more vegetation available. So they were able to gather more grasses. They were able to gather more berries and more roots, other than their northern neighbors who had hardly anything to work with. They still had to travel far through the snow and swamps to find enough food to eat. So they still had to travel to places to find the food that they wanted, just like the Arctic region. They hunted, they fished, they set traps for food, like caribou and elk, ducks and geese, waterfowl, black bears. They built shelters, which included the teepees. One of the shelters that they were more famous for was a pit house. And a pit house trapped heat inside during the winter. They also built lean-tos as well. That was a pretty popular shelter in the forest. So let me see if I can show you a picture of a pit house. I'm ripping my book here. Pit house. We're gonna go with pit house sub, if I can spell. Okay, so these would be examples of pit houses, and they were built in the dirt. And so then they would, and I'm hopefully you got your screen big enough that you can see this, but they would hunt in the dirt, or hunt. They would build their pit houses in the dirt or in a hole, and then they would fill it in with like a maybe like some wood lumber roofing, and then they would have a hole in the middle. So when they had their fires, the smoke would come out of the hole, so they didn't, suffocate from fire. And that was a way for them to keep warm. This particular style of house, they could keep warm. This was the subarctic. So they did have pit houses. They also did have lean-tos as well. Let me see. I don't know if they were as, again, these are lean-tos. And you can see even in this little diagram, they have a little tent. It's like kind of like a half tent. And it was on two trees or two trees side by side. And that's to create the lean-to that they made. This definitely probably wouldn't have kept them as warm as a pit house. But they were known for that as well. Pretty cool. So that's a subarctic. Again, what I want you to see is I want you to see the difference between the different regions and what they had to work with. Okay. I don't by any means want you to you're not going to memorize all of this stuff, but I want you to see the different adaptations that these Native American groups at the time had to adapt to. So Californian was another one I think we missed. And that one, whoops, I flipped it. That one was actually right, I don't know why it does that, right here. I think it was in blue for you guys. This is the Californian region. This included roughly California, maybe a little bit of Mexico. The Sierra Nevada mountain range kind of was a barrier to the east for these guys. The temperature was mild in northern parts of the culture area. So, but the further south you go, the temperature got warmer. Again, the equator. Rainfall was pretty varied, as much as this area was dry, but much of it was dry, but they still did get rain. Sorry. They had a coastline, obviously, because they were near the Pacific Ocean. They had forests, they had grasslands, they had wetlands, they had valleys, they had deserts. So they had a lot to work with in the Californian area. They had a variety of an environment. So they primarily hunted, fished, and they gathered. There was tribes that lived along the coast. They hunted birds and ducks with slingshots and nets, and they ate shellfish and deer and elk and antelope and plants. So because they had a variety of a different, I'm saying it wrong, because their environment had so many different various temperatures, they were able to have a lot more to use. I hope I said that right. So they had an abundance of food. They did have permanent villages. They lived in houses made from pole frames covered with grass, brush, bark, or earth. They didn't really need to move due to the climate or food shortage, so they were pretty permanent where they were. They also built luxury sweat lodges, and those sweat lodges were things that they used daily, and that's where a lot of the male Native Americans, California Native Americans, would bond, and they would relax, and they would have a good time in their sweat lodges. They used animal skins, they used plants to create clothing. They didn't wear too much clothing when it was a warmer type of temperature. But of course, when it got cooler in the winter months, then they definitely put on some clothes. This Californian region was probably one of the most highly populated because there were so many resources. It reduced the competition between Native American tribes to have to fight for resources. So allowing them to live peacefully compared to some other Native Americans in different culture areas that they had to continuously fight for their supplies and resources. So they developed trading systems. They had a very high interest in a variety of different goods to trade with. So this was probably one of the highly populated areas right here, just like it is today, in all honesty. This area is very highly populated, okay, because of its climate. Is this the last one? No, two more. Two more. The Great Basin, which is right here. It was like the orange color. The Great Basin. Yeah. This is a desert region. It's between the Rocky Mountains, which is right about here, and in between the Sierra Nevada mountain ranges. So it's got two mountain ranges, and they're right in the middle, smushed in the middle. They had hot, dry summers, and they had cold, snowy winters. So because this area was a desert, most of the water here came from the snow melt from the mountains, not rainfall. A small group of Native Americans in the Great Basin area roamed this area in search of food. They gathered fish and they hunted, just like most of them did. One thing that they hunted for, which was a delicacy for them, was the pine nut. And they used this nutritious nut for making soups and breads, and it was like a delicacy, a popular thing, a dish for them. So they roasted them, they stored them, they hunted meat just like all the other Native Americans as well. They had their antelope, they had their rabbits and things like that. They moved frequently in search of food because during the late spring, early fall, they would move frequently. They lived in quickly assembled structures made of brush, so they lived in pretty much portable living conditions or shelters. In the cold months, the Great Basin Indians ate food stockpiled, so they saved a lot of their food back for the winter. And they lived in permanent underground homes that provided their warmth. I don't know if I can find a picture. We'll see. But they had they lived in teepees, but they also lived in like the underground pit houses as well. Again, they didn't wear much clothes during the hot summer weather, and then they dressed warmer in the winter. Animal hides was their big thing they used because they had that. And then the last little spot is the plateau, which is the little brown area right here, the plateau. This region had harsh cold winters and mild summers. So this is a high plateau. So you've got the two mountain ranges, you've got the Rockies, and you've got the Sierra Nevada. And unlike the Great Basin, which is kind of like a dip, like a flat, like a bowl, you've got the plateau, which is a high, flat mountaintop, I guess I should say. So these Native Americans, the plateau Native Americans, they caught salmon, and other fish in the freshwater rivers that they had. They hunted in the forest for deer and elk and other game. They did acquire eventually when the Europeans introduced horses. They began to follow and hunt the buffalo as well, which would make sense because they're very close to the Great Plains as well. The Great Basin, Native Americans also did too. They followed the buffalo also. They built their winter homes by digging underground rooms. Again, very much like the pit houses. They put a ladder in the bottom of it so they could come up and out, and the hole so the smoke would come up. So they did have pit houses as well. They made most of their clothing from animal hide. Some of the tribes wore wooden armor for war. Some of the Plateau Native Americans. Would you want to live alone in the wilderness? Like, I personally would not want to live alone in the wilderness, but many Plateau Native Americans did. Plateau Indian boys and some girls were expected to live alone in the wilderness for many days. And so while they were living alone, the young Plateau Indians would fast, which means they wouldn't eat for long periods of time, and they would pray to their spiritual guardian to appear to them in a vision. And when the young boy or girl returned, the tribal leaders, the elders of the tribe, would help them understand the vision that they had. And so this was called a vision quest. And so when they completed this vision quest, they became adults. So this was something that the Plateau Native Americans believed. I found that kind of interesting. Kind of cool. Kind of interesting. And I think that's it. I think those are the 4 or 5 that we missed from yesterday. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to stop the video there because that's a lot of information. And I really just wanted you to get the second part of this. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video, and I'm not going to put a Google form attached to this one today. I just wanted you to watch the rest of this. And then if you haven't done the Google form, you want to go back to, what is today? What is today, guys? Is today Thursday? Yeah. You want to go back to like Tuesday and make sure you finish that Google form. Okay? All right. I will talk to you later. Bye.